Hello and welcome back to the Next.js Django DRF e-commerce store build. This is part 2. So the big headline here is that we're going to be setting up Django session authentication on the back end, and then on the front end we're going to be utilizing Next in order to log in a user and access data from Django. This tutorial will feature HTTP-only cookies, for example, material UI. We will go through hooks such as Xstate, useEffect. And then in addition to that, we are going to be utilizing Xstate within this project. So we're going to be utilizing Xstate to manage our state within our application globally. In this tutorial, I'm just going to set all of this up onto essentially just one page so we can see what's happening, we can see the workflow, and then we'll start to abstract some of that code in later tutorials and then manage that so that we can then, for example, access the state throughout the whole application. So for those who need a little bit of a demonstration, here we're going to set up a simple login form. Now remember, this isn't the end login form. Like I said, we're just going to set up code in this tutorial so that we can then, like I said, abstract and start to theme our login and arrange our code differently in our project in the next tutorial. So here I can log in. I've got the Django backend started. So for example, if I don't log in properly, then I'll sort that out so that we can get an error response and we can do something on the page to kind of capture that. That's not a problem. But eventually, if we go back to the application, if I were just to refresh the page, notice that in actual fact, we do collect our csrf token straight away from just entering the page. So let's type in the username and password. We're going to sign in. That's going to redirect us to a separate page called dashboard. Notice that when I do log in, we're taken to dashboard, and I'm returning from Django just the username, for example, in this case. But you can see here that I've set up automatically the session ID, and that's set to HTTP only, so both the csrf token and the session ID token. So you might not be thinking there's too much going on here, but there's a lot to explain. There's lots to go through, and like I said, this is going to be a two-part tutorial where we just set up first the code and get it working. And I'll take you through the process. And like I said, in the second part of the tutorial, we'll start to arrange this code, abstract it out a little bit into other files, etc., and then set up the global state, as well as theme this a little bit more appropriately to our existing theme. If you haven't seen that, we're building this e-commerce store. So we have already in the previous tutorial set up all of our products that we're accessing from the Django server. So let me just take you through what's happening here. So in order for us to send a login request, we are going to need a csrf token. So the first step here, in Next, we're going to request on the page load a csrf token from Django. So we'll get that sent back from Django as a HTTP-only cookie. We'll store that in the browser. So here we've got in the browser our csrf token, and then Next is also running. So now we can send a login request. Now to send a login request, we're going to need our csrf token. So we send that across to Django. Now if we do authenticate with Django, what's going to happen is Django is going to set up a session in the back end. Now here we're utilizing database sessions. So it's going to set up a session in the database. So what a session is here then, very briefly, is basically a record of a user that's currently, for example, logged in or authenticated. So we'll have a session ID, a unique identifier for that user, and then any other data that might be in that session. Now, by default, Django places the user name of that user who's logged in into the session data behind the scenes. Now, the session data isn't passed across to Next, only the session ID is passed across to Next. So what happens is that Django will set up that session data. So in the database, we store the session ID that's generated, a unique identifier, and then also in the session information will be the user ID. Right, so the session ID gets sent back to Next and is stored as a HTTP only cookie. So now in our browser, we have a csrf token and a session token. Okay, so that's stored in the browser. So the key here is now anytime we send a request to Django, the browser automatically also sends the csrf token and the session ID. And that way, any request we send to Django, we can now authenticate based upon the session ID that we've sent across the user. So if the session ID matches that we send across to the session ID that's stored in the database, we now know that the user is logged in or authenticated, and we can now Django can now perform actions based upon the fact that that user must be logged in. So here everything evolves around that session ID and the fact that the user information is inside of that session data in the session database that's stored in Django. So now we know that, we can then perform other tasks. For example, we can now use that username or that user who's been identified in that session to collect specific data. And of course, we can then use security tools to filter out and to ensure that that user cannot access certain data, or they can access certain data. So in this system, what we're going to do, just to set this up initially, is we're going to collect information about the user and then just send it back to Next.js and then just show you on the page that information. And that will then confirm the fact that the user is logged in. So in terms of the front end here, Next.js, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to store somewhere in what I'm referring to state. So we're going to store somewhere some data in Next, the fact that the user is logged in. So what we're going to be utilizing here is Xstate. So we're going to create a state. So is the user logged in? A Boolean yes or no. So when we do log in, we'll then change that Boolean, that state, to user is logged in. And then throughout the application, we'll use that to check to see if the user is logged in or not. Of course, at this point, we can only get data from Django if we do have the correct session ID and csrf token. So the user will only be able to access certain pages based upon the state, whether they're logged in or not. Now, if they were to kind of change that to they are logged in, but they're not actually logged in, that's not a problem because we won't be able to get data from Django unless we have the csrf token and the session ID matching the session ID in the Django database. Okay, so just to reiterate, once we've set this up, let's just remember the fact that any request we send across will automatically send the csrf token, the session data ID, the session ID, and then we'll be able to perform actions. So every request we send to Django will have that information, and then we can perform actions in Django and send back the data to the user. That's key here. So let's get started by heading over to the previous tutorial. And then in the description here, you'll find at the bottom is the code repository. So let's just open that. So I will be starting from this. I will just go ahead and download this rather than pull this down. And let's get started. So by all means, if you know how to download and get started, the code starters, then please do just skip ahead. Just in case for anyone who's maybe new to this and just wants to get started, I always try and accommodate that as well. So go ahead and just download the code. Then you'll need to put it into a folder, extract it. So I do recommend once you've extracted the folder, then just to go in and then just to cut that out and put it on the root here. So this is a long folder path here. So when we actually open up the command prompt, unless you just remove the path from the command prompt, it's a really long command prompt string there. So path. So go ahead and do that. So now we have the two folders. So let's open Visual Studio Code. So go ahead and open up the folder you've just created, and I'm going to create a new instance for Django and Next. So first of all, I'll select Django, So let's just get Django up and running. So all you need to do here, there's a requirements file here. So if you're new to Django, py. So you're going to need Python installed, of course, and then let's just create a virtual environment. Like I said, if you're familiar to this, you can skip ahead. So we're just going to install the requirements now. So pip install the requirements. So I'll just press tab there. So there's a few requirements here that needs to be installed. So once that's done, we should be able to run the server. There we go. So that's all up and running. Right, so let's do a similar thing with the Next instance. So I've opened up a new window, file, new window. So you can see the window at the back here. It says Django. So this is a new window in front. So let's just open a new folder again. So this time we go into the next and the core and then just select that folder. So what we need to do here is run npm run, also npm install, sorry. So that's just going to install all dependencies that we're going to need to get this working. So that'll take a few moments. Okay, so once that's done, npm run development. So you can see that it says there is a problem. So that's because the port's already in use. So let me just close down the preview I showed you and run that again. It looks like the port's already been used, so I don't know, I thought I closed that. Maybe not. Okay, now we're good. Okay, so now we started with that. So let's go back in and just test this. So Django is going to be on the 127.0.0.1 8000. So that's where Django is going to be placed. And then the next is going to be on the localhost 3000 port. There we go. So you can see instantly it's all working. So we've got all the products here from Django. We've got the categories. So this is all done in the previous tutorial, of course. So we can click on the individual products. And there we go. Right, so we're ready to start. So just very quickly, I forgot to address the fact or introduce what it is we're doing. And the fact I've made a few changes here. So originally we had the basket as the second part, but I wanted to introduce to you state management before we get into that in sessions, and it was just easier to do that through accounts. So here we're going to have accounts part 1 and 2 to begin with, and then we move on to the basket. Just in case you were wondering, I changed the path here for this e-commerce store build. So let's get started. We're in Django. Yep, Django. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a new app. So start app, and we're going to call that account. So this is running a very similar setup to the Django e-commerce store if you're following that tutorial series. So now we have this new application. We just need to hook this up. So in the core settings, you might imagine, we're going to need to add the account there. So at the moment, we're not going to create a database. We will potentially create a custom database later on, but for now, that will be absolutely okay. So second to that, we're just going to need to create a new path for this. So this is going to be the path to the URL. So we're going to set up some different URLs for this. So let's do that. It says account, namespace is going to be account. Okay, so that's that done. I'll keep getting asked for that. So just click on Python, click on the Python exe, press save. Black is not installed. Black should be installed. So let's just go ahead and install Black. So Black is a Python formatting tool or code styling tool. So yeah, we've already installed Black, so I'm not too sure what it's asking. Right, so that's that done. So let's go over now to the new app. Sorry, let's create a new file, urls.py. Right, so what we're going to do here then is set out some URLs. So we're going to need 2, I think, or 3 here. So the first URL is going to be allow the user to access or generate a csrf token. The second URL is going to be for the actual login, and then the third URL we'll have for example, just get the username for now, some user data. So just get the username for the user and send it back to the front end. So from Django.urls, let's import the path. This is why. Okay. Okay, so we're going to need to bring in the views. So from .views, let's import the views. And then we did give this an app name. we did give this an app name. Account. There we go. Okay, so the URL patterns that we're going to be utilizing. So we have 3 URL patterns. So the first one is going to be to generate a CSRF token. And the second one is going to be for logging in. And then the third one we're just going to use to collect the username from the user and then just send it back just to confirm really that we've logged in and we can access data. So now we're going to head over to the views here in accounts. So let's go ahead and create a new function here called get csrf. So obviously that matches up our view get csrf there. So now we're going to generate a token. So response is going to be a JSON response. So we'll just send an arbitrary kind of text to confirm that the token has been set. And then we'll also send across a token. So that's the xcsrf token. So that we're going to get a token, basically send that across to. Right, so then we return the response. So there's 2 components here in the response. One is just going to be a text response that we can collect. And then the second one is basically getting and sending across the CSRF token. Right, so we're going to need to bring in a few things here. So you can see that we're going to need to bring in JSON response and get token in order to kind of generate a token. So let's just bring this in. So we're going to need JSON response. We're not going to need our render, so we'll get rid of that. And we're going to need get token. That's from the Django middleware CSRF. So that enables us to kind of generate a token. And that's all we need, I think, at this point. Okay, there seems to be some strange going-ons with my project here. So let's just double check the requirements again. Oh, excuse me. So I'll just double check we've installed everything. So that'll take a couple of seconds. Okay, so let's just get rid of these 2 for now. So we're just going to be running the one view. So import name account. Oh, sorry. Account. Yep. Views. Cannot import name views. Oh, sorry. From import views. Apologies. Right. So this path is now working. It's connected to our view. So let's go ahead now to the front end to see if we can collect this CSRF token. So open up your Visual Studio Code window with Next.js. So we're going to go into the pages now, and we're going to create a new page here. So let's just call this page login.js. So let's just start our login page. So we're here in the core, our Next.js implementation. In the pages, I've created a new page called login.js. I've just set this up, so let's just test to see if it's working. Now remember how pages work here. We just need to type in the name of the page. So our page is called login. So that takes us to the page, and you can see here that we didn't include the default export. So let's just go ahead quickly and put that in. Default login. Okay, so let's just go back, refresh the page. You can see that the page is now working. Right, so that's our page set up. Apologies if that was a little bit too quick. Right, so now we're going to send a request to capture or to generate from Django a CSRF token. So we're going to borrow useEffect from React to run some code when the page loads. So we're going to collect the CSRF token on page load, essentially here. So we're going to be able to do that through the useEffect hook. Right, so first of all, we're going to need to bring in React. We're going to be utilizing the Xstate as well, so we'll just bring that in for now. Right, so now we can go ahead and just create a new useEffect. So I just set this up. So inside of here, let's just finish that off. So by all means, go ahead and have a look at the manual if you've not used this hook before. So with that in place, let's go ahead now and fetch. So we're going to be utilizing fetch still for this. So we just need to identify our endpoint. So let's just double check we understand what our endpoint's going to be. So just going back into Django here, remember we've created a new application and we've created a URL. That URL is just csrf/, but remember we're just going to, so we're extending our URLs from our core, and in here, the account, what we're going to do is type an account here /. So in order to get to our URL here, it's going to be account /, we're then including the URLs in the account. So account /csrf/. So that's going to be the endpoint to get our csrf token. So going back into our code here, this is going to be the endpoint. So localhost 8000, that's where our server is running, account, then csrf. So that's what we're going to fetch. So once we received the data, we want to do something. So then we get the kind of result, and we can then do something with it. So let's go ahead and let's grab the csrf token. So csrf token, and then what we're going to do is grab it. So from the results, we need to go into the headers. This is how to get the information get. Now we did send across this information, so we're going to find this in the X-csrf token. So here we're going to get the token, csrf token. So that's going to access the token from the response. Now, what we want to do here really is kind of set this up and add it to our state on the page. So we're going to use the Xstate facility here to store some basic information. So this is kind of the first store that we're going to be utilizing. So let's just go ahead and set that up. So up the top here, let's just add a state. So just a basic state. Now this comes with kind of two parameters here. First of all, we can include how we want to access the data, csrf token. So we define that, and then we define how we want to update or set the command to kind of update. So set csrf. So if we want to access the information, we access it through csrf token. If we want to change the data, we're going to use set csrf. And so that's going to equal the Xstate. And at the moment, it's not going to include anything. There we go. So we set the state, Xstate, the initial state, to nothing. And then basically, if we want to set information in there, we use the set csrf. If we want to access it, we use csrf token. There we go. So let's set it. So we're going to just say set csrf. There we go. And then that's obviously going to equal our new token that we've returned. There we go. Okay, so all I've done there is I've collected the token that has been returned and I put it into state. There we go. Right, so we may as well just catch any errors. So let's just catch any errors. So we just we console log this out. There we go. We could abbreviate here, can we? I need one. There we go. So we're just going to console log any problems there. So what we can also do here, just to check to see if we've got this, let's just console.log, because at this point we've set the token. So let's use our let's actually collect the token and display it in our logs. There we go. So we're going to fetch the token, get the token from the header, and then store it within our use state here, so we can access it throughout the page or utilize it again. We're going to need it, for example, when we log in. So that's when we're going to need it. So we can then go ahead and console log the fact that we've got our token. So let's just give this a go. So let's just refresh, F12 this. I'm just going to remove my existing cookies. Let's go to my console log and let's refresh. So it says failed to fetch. So the problem I've got now then is I need to go back into Django and set up my cause policy. So at the moment, because I'm running, for example, my Django here on localhost 8000 and my origin is localhost 3000, for example, it's blocked me because it's assuming that I'm not potentially on the same origin here. So what I need to do here is set up in Django the cause, and then configure it to allow kind of cross-site origin access to my Django application. So let's start off then by installing the Django core headers. So back in Django, just stop the server, Control C, and we just run the pip install Django core headers. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we need to go into the core settings. And we're going to need to add it here. So it's just following the guidelines here if you're not too sure. So core headers, and then we're also going to need a bit of middleware. So we'll go ahead and do that. So in Django, let's just add it to the installed apps, and then in the middleware, let's just go back. So it's given us an indication that potentially needs to be above the common middleware here. So let's just make sure we've done that. So it can be useful to, it can be important, sorry, to put it in the right place. So let's just put it right there. Let's just double check that. So that was above the common middleware, apologies. Let's go back. There we go. Right, so once we've done that, we'll then go to the bottom because we want to make some configurations now for this. So what we saw earlier then was the fact that Django doesn't like us, or it doesn't like the fact that potentially we're on a different domain and we're trying to access the server. So what we need to do is we need to set up cause here to basically say, yeah, that domain is valid. We can access, or we can allow data from that domain, this cross-site domain access. So what we can do here is we can set up allowed origins. So cause allowed origins. So you can see here I've put in the our next server, localhost 3000. So we're just accepting the fact that we can access data and provide csrf tokens to this site. So we define that. Now what we can also do is to expose some headers. So expose the csrf token, so maybe we can then collect that data. And then in addition to that, we want to also, for example, set up some other settings. So let me just paste them in and I'll give you a quick explanation. So here, csrf cookie HTTP only. So we set the csrf and session cookie to HTTP only. And you can see here we've got the cookie same site lax. So this is going to allow us to send csrf tokens, or cookies, sorry, in external requests. And like I've said here, we're setting up to block, essentially utilizing HTTP only. It blocks client-side JavaScript from accessing the csrf and session cookie, and that can provide some security. So here, just to confirm, this is basically, here we're generating a list of, for example, all the headers that are exposed to the browser. Now there's just one more setting that we can also apply, and that's the core allowed credentials to true, and that allows the cookies to be sent along with cross-origin requests. So the final setting, the core allowed credentials to true, so that's the final setup we're going to run with here to allow all this magic to happen. So if you're not too sure what this is. If you need more information, just go over to the Django core headers and just read through this page. It pretty much spells out all the settings that we've applied, how to apply them, and gives you a little bit more detail than I've provided. So let's go ahead now and run the server. Let's go back to our page and refresh. Okay, so cannot read property get of undefined. So you can now see we're not getting the same problem, but it looks like we've got a problem here in line 11. So let's csrf token res header get csrf token. Okay, so I think what's happening here, first of all, is that I'm not using that correctly. Okay, so I've done two things. First of all, we need headers and not header. I do apologize. And then second, I've just moved the console log out of the user effect for no particular reason. So yeah, we just need headers, not header. So that was the problem, I think. So let's go back and refresh. And you can now see I'm returning our csrf token. So at this point, although we're returning the token, what we want is the browser to automatically put that token inside. If I go to application here, we want it to actually put it inside of a cookie as HTTP only as well. So we want to store that here. So the problem is here is that it's not happening. So what we need is an extra setting. So let's go back into our login here. We're going to need to define here credentials. So just add that back in. So credentials, some added parameters here. So in the fetch, comma, and then credentials include. So with this setting, what we're saying is anytime, for example, we set up any cookies or session data inside of our cookies, we want to also send that across with the request. Now it just happens when we set this up, for example, now if I refresh and get a token again, you can now see that's been exposed, and it allows the browser to actually then insert the csrf token inside of a cookie in your browser. Now that is now exposed, or potentially we can now expose that every time we make a request to the server. So hopefully that makes sense. There's a few things there you might want to read up on, but I've kind of outlined it hopefully, and I've kind of built this up so you can see what's happening here step by step. So let's just go back into the settings here. Just remind ourselves these cores here. So we're allowing these domains to be able to have access to things like our csrf token. That's what we're doing here. And these are typically maybe domains that are on other servers or other domains, etc. So cross-site kind of server deployments. So that's what we're setting up here. Now this setting here, core allow credentials, I've set this now to false. So what happens now if I refresh, get rid of the cookies and refresh, you can see we're not actually being passed over that, and we're not then storing that csrf token. So if I just quickly change that back to true, that is now allowing me to kind of expose that. I'm exposing the headers here, and that's going to allow me to set those again. So if I set that to true, okay, I think I've got a mistake here in my URLs. So if I set that to true and turn the server back on and then refresh my page, you can now see we have access to that, and it's now storing here in my browser. And now I can utilize that with every request to the server automatically. And remember that HTTP only means that Next isn't going to be able to access this and then utilize it. So this is kind of a purely kind of a browser-based technology. Oh, I don't know why I said that. A browser-based kind of implementation. But hopefully you can see how things are starting to connect up now, and the fact that this is stored in our browser and we can now utilize that to send requests across automatically. Okay, so now over to Material UI. Let's just quickly build up a login form for our page so we can then log in. So let's start off with a nice container. So this is going to be a component main, max width is going to be XS. So that just contains this container into a small size, XS, so extra small. And then I'm bringing baseline, CSS baseline, and then create a new paper facility here. So this is basically just a tool that allows me to create a a div and set some parameters in paper. So here inside of here, I'm going to have an avatar. So I'll bring that in. I'm going to bring in a class in a minute, avatar. So that's just a nice kind of icon. And then the typography. So we're just going to have sign in variant H5 variant. So I'm going to set up a H1 component. So this isn't going to say typography in the front end. It's going to be a H1 component. And variant means it's going to be styled as a H5 because H1 is really massive text. So H5 is smaller text for sign in. And then I create a form. So what I'm going to do here in this form then is create a new class for it. And then on submit, I'm going to send this to a function called handle submit. So that's going to handle that submission. So that's me connecting this up to some logic on submit. So that's going to happen shortly. So we're going to create, first of all, a text field for the username. So this is the first field that we'll build. Now what we want to do, every time someone types something in, we want to send this off to the state. So when I type in a letter, we store that in state. And then once we've finished typing in, all that information is going to be stored in state. And then we can access that information and then submit it. So when we submit this information, we can then collect that information from state. So the idea here, just to confirm, is that when we type in letters into the input form, we're going to store this information inside of a state that we're going to set up. So we're going to set up set username, and we're going to store that in a new facility up here in our Xstate, sorry. So every time we type a letter in, it's going to store it there. When we press submit, we go to that function and we collect that information from that state, and then we use that to send across to the server. So we'll then create another text field here, and we'll do exactly the same thing again. So we'll set the password. Every time we type something in, it's going to send it across to that set state. And then when we press submit, then take that information from that state, send it across to the server again. So we've got just some buttons here, a button down here, type submit. That's the most important aspect there. So we've got some classes, just some different variants and colors, etc. And then underneath here, we've got a nice little grid here to maybe a link, forgot password. So we're not going to implement it here. And then, for example, maybe a link to do you have account, sign up instead. So we'll implement that at a later point. So with all that done, that pretty much summarizes all that. So now what we can go and do is we can now kind of bring in a few things. So let's just set this up with all the tools that we're going to need here. So we brought in a load of different facilities from Material UI. So what we're going to need to do is just bring them in, and I do apologize, you just need to use a repository here. So these are going to be all the tools that you're going to need here for that. So we're going to need to then connect that up through your styles. So here, for example, this is all going to be accessible through your styles. So let's just put that up the top here. Okay, so that basically connects these components through here into our styles that we're now going to build. So let's go ahead and create some styles. So again, I do apologize. This is it right here. So we've got some different classes we've already built. So the paper, let's go down here, and we've built this class is paper. So we're accessing the classes through, we go further up here, we brought them in to this function right here. Again, this is then connected to our classes here. So paper, we just add some styling here, avatar styling, form styling, submit styling. That's pretty much all we've got there. So that needs to be on, that needs to go just there. So let's go back now to our page and see if that works. Handle submit is not defined. So now we need to kind of set everything up and hook everything up now. Right, so we set out two new areas where we want to store data. Right, remember we want to store data about the username and the password. So let's just go ahead and set that up. So we're going to store the username. So that's going to be set username. So we store that. Like I said, every time someone types something in, it's going to be stored. And then also the password. So those are the two parameters that we're going to need to log in. So let's set the password. Remember, the first here is to access the data. The second is to actually set the data. So that's set password. Cool. Right, so you can see that if they're not grayed out, it means that they're actually being utilized. If it was grayed out, it means they're not actually being utilized in your code. So because we've already set this up, they're not grayed out. Right, so we're now storing that. Right, so we're storing the csrf token, the username and password. Right, so with that done, we can now set up our submission function to handle the submit. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's just try and get this into some sort of order. So we've got our use effect here. So let's put it underneath here. So this is going to handle the submission. So we want to prevent the default first. There we go. Right, so load up. So it loads up now. You can see it loads up. You can see everything that's going to, what it's going to look like. Like I said, we'll finish the styling in a different tutorial. We just want to get this started to begin with. Right, so with that in place, we're now going to need to send a fetch across. Yep, so we need something to fetch, of course. So let's go ahead and set up now Django so that we can actually log in. Right, so back into Django. So we've already set up the path, so let's just activate this path. So we're going to make a new view called login. So let's go into the views. So this is going to require post, right? So in order to access this view, we want to make sure that it comes from a post request. So let's bring in that declarator and then we can do require post. There we go. That's the first thing. Right, so you don't need to be logged in to access this, of course, because we want to log in. So we've called this login. Maybe we should call this login view. So let's go back into our URLs. Login view. Let's just call this login view. Right, so that's our login view. Request. Cool. So bring in the request. Right, so what we want to do then is we want to collect the data from the request. So that data is going to be stored in the body. So if you've used DRF or APIs before, we know that we send the data in the body. So the header information is all the technical information about whether we should send or receive, how we should send and receive, etc. And then in the body is the actual payload. So here we're just going to say data equals JSON dot, and then go into, we need loads and then request body. So we're just going to collect the data. Right, so that's the first thing. So we're going to collect it as JSON. So okay, so we're going to need to import JSON because we're using that. So we're bringing that in. So that will now collect our data for us. Now we can just extract. So we've got the username and password. So how do we know what they're called? That's the important thing here. So let's just go back into the so we are storing it as username and password, the information. So we will set that up. I think that's important right now. Apologies. So let's just go back into Django. Sorry. So we'll store that as username and password. So in that data that we send across, username and password, we extract that out, data.get, username and password. We'll store it in these variables here. And now we can then utilize that to check to see if we can log in. Now, if, for example, I suppose we need to do a little bit of a check here. So if there is no data here, we may as well kind of validate or do a bit of validation before we even send off and try to authenticate the user. So here, for example, we can just say something simple like, if username is none or password is none, then we can just return a response. So let's just return, change my indentation. So let's just return a JSON response. Just double check I've got that. Yep. And then info please ensure that you have included please what about please username and password is needed. There we go. Right, so now we've got that in place, we can then now try to authenticate. So how are we going to authenticate is a little bit like this. So we're going to bring in from Django contrib auth, we're going to import the authentication tools. So Django views, Django contrib auth import authenticate. Okay, so we're going to need to log in also, so let's just bring those tools in as well. So we're bringing the existing tools in that Django has behind the scenes to try and authenticate the user and log them in. Right, so what we can now do is just pass those details over to that and check and try and actually log the user in. So let's give it a go. So we'll say that the user equals authenticate. So we're going to try and authenticate now. So what do we need to authenticate? Well, we need the username. So we brought in authenticate from Django, and now we're going to try and authenticate the user. So username equals username. That's what we've collected from the user in the front end. And then password equals password. Cool. Right, so with that set, hopefully at this point, we've tried to authenticate the user. Right, so at this point, hopefully what we return is a user. So we should return a particular user. So let's go ahead now and set up an if statement. Excuse me. So if user is none, so we don't return a user, no user exists. Let's just respond. We'll just say info user does not exist. Okay, or something like that. So we can send a status along with that if we wanted to. Maybe a 400 status. Okay, so that's all good. So let's now go along and login, request, and user. And now let's just return. So we're going to now return another JSON response if we can log in. So just send some information across, or whatever you want to send across. User logged in successfully. There we go. Right, so that pretty much solves that login process. That's all that's going to happen here. So if we do log in, we're going to send some information back. In addition to this, what's happening is we're setting up a session. So let's not forget this, of course, and that session ID is now going to be sent back to the headers, to the front end, and it's going to then be stored as a cookie in our browser, and we can then send that in the headers whenever we make a request for more data. So now we have the tools to actually log a user in. Let's go back to the front end here, and let's go ahead now and fetch the data. So I guess the first thing that we need to do is set up the fetch. So not fetch the data, we need to actually log the user in. So we want to send a request then to account login. That's the path that we've set up. So we're going to need some parameters to do that. So the type of method we want to send this data, that's going to be post. Now we want to send some headers. We can do that now. So we're going to send content type, application JSON, and the csrf token. Now we already have the csrf token, so let's just manually send this across and then just see if we can do this without manually sending it across, so utilizing the headers to automatically send it across. So let's put that in for now. So we're going to use credentials include again. There we go. And then we want to also now stringify the data and send it across. So we want to send the data across as JSON. So the body, this is the data that's going to be included in the body, the username and the password. So just to clarify, this username and password is coming from our state, our username and password. So remember, when we type it into the input, it's going to be stored in our state. And now we're just going to access it through username and password when we need it. There we go. So here we're going to set up our code. So we're setting up our code here to our data so it can then be utilized on the back end. So it's important that we set it up as JSON because we're expecting it as JSON on the back end. So if you're not too sure what that is, you can see it converts JavaScript values into JavaScript object notation, JSON string. And that's what we're expecting on the back end, a JSON string. Right, so let's test to see if we can send it. Right, so once we've done that, we're going to do that. So we want to finish that. Okay, so we've got that in place. So now we want the response. So we want to deal with the response now. So then let's just grab the response. We want to do something. So let's just check to see if we've got a response. Now in the response, we can check to see the parameter response is okay. So let's just check that. So response. So if the response is okay, that would be true. So response dot okay. So we're saying if the response is false, then there must be an error. If we didn't get a good response, an okay response, then we want to throw an error, right? So let's throw new error. Could not connect to server, for example. There we go. So we're going to throw this error if there's a problem. Now, of course, we may be okay, in which case let's move on. So if we are okay and we do collect the data, let's get this data. Let's get this data and do something with it. So let's just first of all console log the data so we can have a look, see if there's any problems, etc. So we do that, and then once we've done that, we can then well, that's it. Let's just see if we can do that. That seems like a good idea. Looks like there's a problem. Okay, of course there is. Okay, so there we go. That's the kind of logic. So what we can also do is catch any errors. So let's just put this in. So catch an error. So as an additionality. So just a console log our error. How about that? Set error. Set our error. And let's call it could not connect to server. Okay. Right. So catch error. Okay. I see. Okay, right, so that should be that. So I guess we can give this a go. So let's go back into the page. Let's just type in admin and admin. Let's sign in. Let's have a look. You can see in the background we now have our session ID. That's been returned. So it looks like I'm logged in. If I go to console, it does say undefined. So I don't think we're returning anything, but you can clearly see here that by retrieving the session ID, HttpOnly session ID, we now have a session ID, so it must mean that we're logged in. So just to tidy this up a little bit now, I'm just going to go in and remove line 58, that console log. Just get rid of that. So let's just go back and try this again. So the data is still returning undefined. So I was expecting to return data. If I go back into Django, I was expecting to return this info. But let's just move on slightly. We'll fix this in a minute. So set error. So here I've created a new state here called set error. So this is line 80. So let's go ahead now and just add that. So I'm going to set this error here. So I'm going to access it as error. So what that means is that on the page somewhere I can call error. So take, for example, just below our paper here. So let's just call error. This is just an example. So I'm going to now use error here. So let's go back on my page. Let's not log in properly. You can now see that the error is now being shown. So obviously you can deal with that however you want to deal with it. So that's the error and how to potentially then pass that error across to a state and then just send it to the screen. So we can now log in. We send data across, we logged in. Everything's now been set up in our headers. So in our application cookies here, we've got the session ID and cookies. So let's just push forward and now create a new page called dashboard. And let's use the session ID just to collect some arbitrary data from the server just to indicate that we are logged in. So let's go ahead and bring in the router from Next, and that's going to allow us to kind of build a redirect. So let's just put this up the top here. So we build a redirect to a different page. This is really simple. We'll just use the router push tool. So down here, then apologies, I hate it when I scroll down. It's horrible to see in a video. So we're going to go down to where we collected the data, and then we're going to push this across. So line 78. So we've logged in, and then we're going to push the user over to the dashboard. So let's just go in now, and in our pages, create a new file called dashboard.js. Okay, right. So now we've got this in place. We want to obviously build this up and display some information. So let's just go back into our Django application again. Let's go into the URLs. Let's activate our third path that we built. So in our account URLs, who am I? So this is going to just collect some information from Django about the user. Just send back the username, right? So let's get rid of this. In the views, we're going to need to set this new view up. It's going to be called Who Am I View. So here we're going to use a class-based view, and we're going to then bring in the session authentication checks, etc. Right, so we're bringing the authentication classes and the permission classes to check to see if the user is actually authenticated, and that's going to give us a clear indication whether the user is authenticated. So let's create a new class. We're going to call this Who Am I View. So we're going to use the API view for this. So we can bring in multiple things here. So the session authentication and basic authentication, we can bring that in the top here. So let's just go to the top, bring that in. Let's just bring in the, let's just bring in session authentication. And then we can also use from the REST framework permission. So is authenticated. So we'll bring that in too. And now we can set that up. So at the bottom here, authentication classes, we can bring them both in. So I'm not going to use this one here for now. Okay, so we bring in the session authentication and is authenticated. Right, so what we want to do now is just to get some basic information about the user, right? So let's use a static method let's create a new function. Get. So on a get request, we're going to take in the request, set the format to none, and then we're going to, let's just print this out. So request, so we're going to get the request dot user dot username. So that's getting the username not from the front end, but the request user. So when we send a request, because we're utilizing the session ID, the session ID is going to allow us to identify the user, because that session ID that gets sent across from Next is then utilized or matched on the server database, the Django server database. And then from there, we can identify the user because the user information is stored in that session. So we can then grab the user and then the username, and then we can send that back. So let's just return that. So return as a JSON response, the username. So we grab that that username, and then we just grab the request.user.username again. Okay, so this is just really a sanity check just to make sure it prints out. So we're going to need to bring in the API view. So at the top here, let's bring in the API view from the REST framework. There we go. I think we're done. Okay, so I think we're done. So let's go back now to the front end. Okay, so go ahead and inside of our next pages here, next framework pages, we have dashboard if you've not already set that up. So we're going to need to import React, the Xstate. So we'll just use that again. We're going to create dashboard. So let's create the dashboard. So we create two states here, one for saving and setting the data about who the person is and then printing it on the page, or outputting it on the page. And then the error state, we can also capture that if we want to. So we're going to use use effect. So when the page loads, we're going to run this. So we're going to fetch the information from who am I. That's the URL that we set out in Django. So we'll send some headers along. So the application JSON, so the content type, and then the credentials include. So that means that we're going to send the csrf token and the session ID across. So that's going to set that up automatically. So you might be thinking we could have done that previously on the login. So then we're going to get a response. So we're going to format that response as JSON. Okay, so we get the response and format it as JSON. And then we can then go into that data and then select the username. That's what we set out in Django, if you remember. So username, let's keep it lowercase. That's a good point. Yep. So we're going to get that data, which should include the username. So let's go back into our dashboard. So we collect that data from username, and then we catch any problems if there's any problems. Right, so all we need to do now is output it to the page. So just create a simple container and then the data. So remember this data, remember we're setting the data that's being returned into our state here using set who am I, and then we're going to collect it using who am I on the page and output it on the page. Right, so with that done, let's go through the process now of logging in, sign in. We should get redirected to a dashboard, and there we go. It now says admin. So we're now logged in, we know who we are, and we can now start to send requests for more data. So let's just recap. We haven't finished yet, but let's just recap. We now have set this function, this system up to grab csrf tokens, to log in a user, get the session ID, save that, and use that session ID and csrf token to get data about that user from Django. And of course, the user is now authenticated. We've tested that in the backend. We've sent data to them. So the final component here I want to show you is utilizing a state management tool. So in this project, we're going to be utilizing Xstate to save the state kind of globally in our project. So we're going to just set this up now just to familiarize ourselves with how to configure this within our application. And then in the next tutorial, we'll set up the context so we can make data available on all pages, for example. So let's just go ahead and install this and just create a basic setup. So the first thing then, let's get back into Next. And we'll just stop the server, Control C. Right, so let's go ahead and install first. So we're going to install Xstate and the Xstate React components. So let's go ahead and do that. That'll take a couple of seconds. So the question is, why are we using this? Well, first of all, we want to use something like this because we want to flag the user as logged in within this system, within the React system here. Sorry, within the Next.js system here. So we want to set out some data that we want to be able to access on all of our pages throughout our system, and we can then utilize that to check to see if the user's kind of logged in the system. Then we can perform some actions based upon that. For example, on the home page in the navigation bar, maybe we want to store whether someone is logged in so that we show them the right navigation bar. For example, instead of showing them login, we now show them the button to log out, for example. So there's many reasons we might want to check whether the user is logged in. So I'm going to take you through how to set this up within our application just to get used to it, and then the next tutorial we'll go and create a much bigger application and set up the context, etc. So let's just start the server again. So we have that running. Okay, so let's go into our login page and let's just set something up here. So what we're going to do when someone logs in, we're going to set the state to they are logged in. So that's all we're going to do. So we'll go through that process with Xstate. So I'm just going to use my own terminology here. So we're going to import the use machine and machine. So there's two components that we're going to bring in. So let's think of machine as the state area and use machine as the way of actually accessing our machine. So think of machines as areas of storage that we want to set up, and use machine as basically if we wanted to collect or do something to that machine, we need to access the machine through that. So I guess we could think of it that way for now. Right, so let's set up a new machine, I guess, this idea of machine. So the machine, now we've set up, for example, now we've gone through the process of setting up our state like this. We've got a general idea of what this kind of means. This is basically just memory area where we're storing data, right? So we're going to do the same thing again. So you may be wondering what's the point when I can just use useState. Well, the idea here is that later on we'll expand this and we'll be able to use this as a context. So we'll be able to save this data somewhere in our project so we can access it on every single page. Whereas useState, by default, we can't do that. So we're going to create this new machine and we're going to give it an ID, toggle, for example. And then we're going to give it an initial piece of data. So the initial state is going to be logged out. So the user by default is logged out, right? So now we need to define our states. So there's two states here, you might imagine, logged in and logged out. So here we're going to create a simple toggle that when the user is logged in, it's going to toggle to logged in. And when the user logs out, it's going to toggle to logged out, for example. So we're going to create these two states. So logged out and logged in. There we go. So logged out on, toggle logged in. Logged in on, toggle logged out. Okay, so you can see here, all I'm doing is setting up a simple toggle for logged in and logged out. So initially I've started off with logged out. When I log in, it's going to then toggle to, when I log in, it's going to toggle to login. When I'm in logged in, I toggle to logged out. It's going to then show logged out. Okay, so with that in place, we now have our simple kind of states in place. Right, so now I need to kind of utilize them. So how I'm going to do that is, let's just go into the, for example, the login area. Sorry for stumbling there. I'm just trying to remember how to do it off the top of my head. So in actual fact, what we need to do now is we need a way of actually manipulating or changing the state. So we need to set that up. So that's going to look very similar to this here. So you can see here that we can send and see the information. So state, that's going to allow us information to get us information from our state. And then send is going to allow us to kind of manipulate data within our state, for example. So what do we want to manipulate? Well, we set out a machine. It was called toggle machine up here. Okay, so that's the name of our state, and this is the data within it, for example. So we access that. So to access data in there, or to edit it, sorry, we're going to send. To access data, we can call state. So similar to the use state here. So this is kind of nice and friendly in respect if you're coming from use state. It makes a little bit more sense than some other tools that you might use. So what we can now do is we can use send. So let's go ahead and do that. So down here then, when we log in, this handles submit. So excuse me a second. Let's go down to our login. Oh, okay, we're in the right place. Okay, so the data here. So before we send them off to the dashboard, let's just remove that a second. We don't want to send them off. We're going to send toggle. So basically, when we are logged in, we're just basically going to toggle our data to true. All right, so let's give this a go. So what I'm going to do is going to console log, and then state. Remember, we access through state, and then the value in the state. So going back up here, you can see that state, that was the name I called it. So that allows me access to that data, and I'm just going to grab the value, the default value. So let's give this a go. So that just outputs that there, and we've got the send toggle. So let's just give this a go, see if it works. So let's go into our login, go into our console. Now it says logged out. So we're printing out the fact we're logged out. So that's coming from our Xstate, right, our machine. So let's log in, admin, I'll sign in. You can now see it says logged in. So you can see how we've changed that state. Now, obviously, we want to now expand upon this, and we want to make that data available on all pages. Because if we were to now go into, for example, the dashboard, this information is only available on this page. So we're going to need to make that available throughout the whole site. And that's what we're going to look to and push forward to in the next tutorials. So I do hope that was useful. There was quite a lot to go through there, and I do want to give you some time now just to reflect upon that, just to explore some different things. By all means, in the next tutorial, we will go ahead and create some context so that we can then access that is logged in or is not logged in throughout the whole system. We'll then add a login facility. We'll shore up all the visuals, the user interface, to make it match our existing application. So we'll do all that in the second part of the accounts, and then we move across to the basket system. So again, I do hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.